as the title suggests, this video is about idea generation, and it's not particularly intended or aimed at one particular group of creatives. I think it's just a general list of things that I find that help me and are probably applicable to people who creatively write or craft things, people animating and doing illustration, because they're quite broad things. So use them for wherever you will. Um, yeah. Um, so one of the main forms of inspiration that I tend to use is music. Um, just mainly because there's so many layers to music itself, both in the way it's sung, the words that are sung, the layers of sounds themselves in the music. The things I particularly wanted to point out were um, more playful kinds of music that people could listen to, that might provide more inspiration, especially if you're stuck. So one form of music I thought would be quite interesting and good for some people is experimental music. Um, it's very atmospheric. I will put some links in the description below so you can look at some of it. It's very atmospheric and bizarre. They use quite interesting sounds. And I think it's really good if you're stuck regarding trying to do any creative writing or trying to develop ideas. Drawing to music generally can trigger a lot of ideas associated with the lyrics within it and the sounds in it, but I feel like specifically with experimental music, um, it can definitely help conjure up new things because it's not something you hear very often. Um, so yeah, as well as that, I've noted concept albums mainly because I think they're just great. Um, I think generally music is great, but with concept albums in particular, specifically Pink Floyd, I think they do them amazingly well, especially because they have a variety of ways that they've done it. So if you want something more narratively inclined, you can listen to The Wall, which quite interestingly like plays with vocals and dialogue, and it's very conceptual and very cool. But then in contrast to that, I think it's The Dark Side of the Moon. I'm not sure if it is. I don't remember the name. I'm not a true fan. But they have one based on human emotions and experiences, and it's amazingly done. It's very abstract. I will probably write it on screen or put it in the description again because I think it's great. And both of them provide much so many different things when you're listening to it, and I think they can inspire you in very different ways, especially if producing imagery or writing inspired by it. So concept albums are very good, especially because, as I said, they're quite experimental. They provide a narrative or a sense of place, and they're just very interesting. So I've also included one of Muse's concept albums and David Bowie because they're both very good as well. Other things you can look at if you want some kind of auditory inspiration is audio short stories. Most of the ones I've seen are horror based, or kind of creepy. So In the Night Vale is kind of creepy. I don't think it's necessarily horrific, but it's quite an interesting take on how to tell a story because it does it through a radio station. Um, and that can be quite interesting if you want that as a form of inspiration, especially if you want something weird to listen to that's quite unique. And then The Magnus Archives is just a very well done horror series, like short horror stories, and they're quite bizarre horror stories as well. They're not the kind of thing that's necessarily overly gruesome, but they're very bizarre. Um, Generally, I feel like if you go through streaming websites like YouTube, you'll find a lot of these kind of things. I've noted those ones because they're series and they're also very well done. Um, I've also noted soundtracks in general because again, there's a wide variety of what you can listen to. You can listen to things with very different kind of sounds in them. For example, the King's Speech soundtrack is very interesting. It's got a lot of textural sounds in it, and it's just fun and interesting. And that, in contrast to the Amazing Spider-Man soundtrack, is very different, which has a lot of electronic sounds and like kind of visceral sounds, and I really enjoy it. But yeah, so it's I think they're very useful in that they can provide very dramatic content. Yeah, I think they're very inspiring in that they can provide those kind of things, very intense content, or very subtle in the case of the King's Speech. Um, I've also noted Lauser, or I don't know how to say his name, I think it's Lauser. Um, they make really interesting music, but they're not making the music. So they take songs that already exist and then they're just editing them with background sounds, and the title to all of them provides a narrative. So I feel like that's a really interesting way to gain inspiration because you can listen to their music and the title will be something like you're listening to this song and you're stuck in a well. I don't think any of them actually say that, but it'll say something like that. Or someone just dumped you and you're in the bathroom crying. at prom or something. I don't know, but it's that kind of thing. And then he has like the sound effects of what the environment will be in the background, and possibly you crying if you're crying at prom. So I think they're really good for inspiring ideas. They're very useful. Um, Another form of idea generation is using words. So you can use a word generator online. You can use a dictionary if you have one. Yeah, I think those are very useful. You can use one word, a combination of words. You can also do the same regarding written prompts. So there are various social media accounts, specifically Instagram. I've seen quite a few which have story prompts, but I'm pretty sure they've come over from Tumblr. But they're really interesting prompts, and again, I'll put that in the description because they're very diverse in what they are. Some of them are surreal, some of them are quite more on the creepy, horrific side. I think they're quite fun if you want to do a short writing prompt or do want to do some drawings based on a short story, or at least develop something based off that. Um, Along with that, you can make your own. So I imagine you could cut out words out of a newspaper. You could take quotes. You could take quotes from books and slot them all together and make your own kind of word prompts. They're a combination of like thoughts and statements from things you've acquired. Um, yeah, another thing I'd recommend is consuming new media, specifically um, quite creative and different media. I think it's important to consume media that isn't something you necessarily enjoy, but can provide you with a very different um, perception of things. So the three that I wanted to note was Waking Life, The Forbidden Room, and Perfect Blue. I wouldn't wholly recommend Perfect Blue because it's a psychological horror, but I have mentioned it just because it's the kind of narrative that plays with the fact that typically with popular films, they provide us a narrative that we can work through and figure out, and then that's part of the process. Whereas in these three films, you're not really allowed to work anything out, and so the narrative is presented in a very different way. And along with that, the concept of reality, the way it's presented, the visual language is used is different in all three of them, and so it's very interesting to watch them. So that kind of content I think is very good in that it can inspire a lot of new ideas, but also the cinematography in them is very interesting. So the shots themselves can be good sources of idea generation. Yeah. Another thing you can use are vision boards, or vision boards like mood boards, visual assortments on a board. Um, I think these are really useful if you have like a weird abstract array of ideas and you're not really sure how to connect them together. So putting them all in one place and be able to connect themes and emotions and moods and patterns and that kind of thing will help you kind of define what it is that you're trying to determine there and what connections you can make between that weird abstract accumulation of ideas are. Or if you're trying to connect two different ideas to play with them, I guess. I don't know. But I think it's very useful. Especially, it's also useful if you're not looking at research resources, but your own work as well. Um, like if you want to assess what's working with what themes are running through your work, especially if you've produced a whole bunch of work inspired like by one of these things, like you've got a whole load of prompts and then you have to try and join them together. Um, you can also do surveys as a primary source of research and as a form of idea generation. So if there's any topic you particularly want to write about or you're interested in, you can send out a survey. People kind of enjoy talking about themselves, from what I can tell. And you can put these online surveys on Facebook, on Reddit, on whatever form of social media, and someone's likely to fill it out if you point out, I guess. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting way to gain idea generation and a resource for producing work. Yeah. I have noted mind mapping. I'm pretty sure everyone does mind mapping, so I don't think I need to explain it, but I do think mind mapping is good if you started a project, you're feeling stuck, you may not have done enough research or found enough context for the subject matter. Having a mind map really helps if you want to ground that subject or kind of branch it out to see where it can go, but also to see what research you could do to help yourself further define what you're doing, and what the work that you're doing, where it's going, kind of thing. Okay. Um, Storyboarding. Storyboarding is really useful. It can be used for so many things. The storyboarding I'm particularly talking about here is sort of storyboarding thumbnailing. So the intent isn't to create something too perfect and finished, but it helps you jot down ideas. It helps you play with things on a smaller scale, so you can just explore different ways of presenting things. So in the image I've provided, I've drawn a few different cans, I think. They're not very adventurous, but the idea is that you could take an object and you could really play with how abstract it could be, what it represents, the styles in which it could be done, different angles, how you can place that in space, and it helps you think about how you're framing shots, how you're communicating things, but also how you can make your subject more interesting. Um, I've also gone through patterns, so I think it's a good way to play with how narratives can be created with patterns or abstract imagery um, through like seeing moods, and it's also a good way to like lay things out next to each other and see how they communicate with one another. And then the last thing I looked at was narrative sequencing. So I think storyboarding in this way can be really useful if you're trying to make a narrative sequence, or you're trying to play with discourse, the way a narrative aligns or doesn't align, how shots communicate, how the shots are done. If you want them to be ominous, if you want them to be more gentle, you can play with the way the shots are done, the style in which they're done. Um, yeah, you can also play with like if you have a group of narratives that are kind of separate, you can see how they can be placed together and see what kind of new narrative you can make out of them. I think that's a very interesting way to go about it. So yeah. The next idea, I'm really sorry if I don't explain it quite right. This is very much my own. Um, it's basically the equivalent of yes and when people are doing improv. So the way I typically would make a character to avoid complicating it is you can use this method for creating a character, for also moving a narrative forward. So I think it works better in the broad context of moving a story forward. If you're stuck, you can question various avenues, how people in the narrative are feeling, they're responding, and it can help you reaffirm their opinions and how they exist in this context and that kind of thing. So it's basically just, it continues the line of questioning at all planes, I think. I don't know if that helps. But I also think it can be useful if you're trying to create a character and you're really struggling to. So I've used it a couple times to create a character by defining the character by an event response scenario. So in the diagram, it will show like an event, response, outcome. I think it's something like that. And so if you really don't know who your character is going to be or what you want to do with this person or how you're going to do anything with this person, I find an easy way to start off that process is by defining the person by this scenario. So create an event, create a response. The way that person responds really determines how they respond to the world, how their temperament may be, and it gives you a starting point to try and figure out what kind of person this might be. Because it hasn't presented you with like a blank canvas who you don't know the emotions of. It's provided you with the basis of that, which is they've responded to this situation like this from this little model I've made. So it then can determine other elements of their life. That might not be helpful for everyone. I think personally I find it more useful, but mainly because I tend to start off with a blank canvas and I can't figure out what to do with them. But yes, I hope that makes sense. It basically is like yes and it's just to continue the line of questions so you don't get stuck in a narrative to keep questioning. Um, in contrast to that, I've provided a very different form of writing because I realize that kind of writing can be very intense and it can involve a lot of overthinking. I think it's more of a planning process than a writing process. So I've noted automatic writing because I love it. And automatic writing can be just throwing words at a piece of paper, throwing a couple of words or phrases at a piece of paper, or whole sentences or whole paragraphs. Um, and the whole point is that you don't restrict what you're saying, you don't think about it, you just say it, you write it out, and you can think about it later when you might be rearranging it or taking bits out or choosing what you might like. I think it's quite a fun way to write because it can create quite abstract phrases and associations. Um, and also, if you're not someone who's very good with creative writing, um, it's a very fun way to work around it so you can still create something that's interesting to read. It's also, again, another good way to generate ideas for drawing and illustrating things. Um, if none of those help, there's also A Quiet Year, which is a game that helps you world build. The aim of the game is to world build, so it's kind of a process in itself that can help you do it for yourself as well. I think it's helpful in that it's a more structured way of doing this kind of thing, so if that's better for you, then I would recommend that. Another thing you can do is you can actually find fillable character sheets online. So again, if you have that blank canvas but you need to create a narrative, um, you can go look for those character sheets. And you don't necessarily fill the whole thing, but it does help you think about all the different aspects of that character. For example, their values, their past, how they're informed by it, their fears, etc., etc. So yes, different sources for different things. I hope some of that was helpful, and hopefully you can implement it in some way, or it can help you get out of any kind of art block. And thank you for listening.